Hey folks, so let's begin to take a look at Jupiter in Capricorn. So Jupiter enters Capricorn on December 2, 2019 and remains there until December 2020. So let's begin to put on our Jupiter in Capricorn hats and sort of get a lay of the land to understand and reflect on some of the major themes and lessons and opportunities that this transit will present for us personally and collectively. So we want to also have a good sense of what Jupiter in Capricorn is up to in the coming year. So Jupiter is entering the Capricorn field where it finds Saturn and Pluto. So Jupiter in Capricorn will join up with Pluto, beginning a new synodic cycle, and essentially Jupiter is within a few degrees of Saturn and Pluto from about March 2020. So in 2020, Saturn dips in and out of Aquarius, and from about July of 2020, we have Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto essentially in step in Capricorn, the three of them in step until December. So the other thing of note is that even though in 2020, Saturn dips into Aquarius from March until the beginning of July, we essentially have a conjunction of Saturn in Aquarius and Jupiter in Capricorn, an out of sign conjunction, but a conjunction nonetheless. So this Jupiter-Saturn dynamic is an undertone throughout 2020 ahead of the official Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius in December. So this interplay between dynamics of growth, expansion, slash excess, and Saturn's rather more contracting influence. So archetypally too, Jupiter in Capricorn also represents this dance between these contrasting influences of expansion or growth and contraction. The other thing of note in terms of what Jupiter in Capricorn is up to is that Jupiter is dancing in a sextile with Neptune. Jupiter in Capricorn is dancing in a sextile with Neptune in Pisces. So 2019 is characterized by these ongoing Jupiter-Neptune squares, Jupiter in Sag, Neptune in Pisces. But as Jupiter enters Capricorn, we have a new phase relationship here between Jupiter and Neptune. So Jupiter in Capricorn is sextile Neptune. So let's take a bit of a step back, a little walk down memory lane, of course, to the last time that Jupiter was in Capricorn. So Jupiter entered Capricorn at the end of 2007 and was in the sign throughout 2008. So it may seem like a long time ago. If you had children at that time, they're already 12, and a lot has happened since then. But if you'll recall, the biggie of 2008 was the global financial crisis. So the narrative went somewhat like this. You know, we had excessive risk-taking by banks such as Lehman Brothers, the US housing bubble, which invariably burst. In the US, the easy availability of credit sort of propped up debt-financed consumer spending, and banks gave more and more loans. And when housing prices in the US declined after the housing boom, institutions that borrowed and invested in what's called subprime mortgage-backed securities had significant losses. So we had a financial system that was expanding, and while that was going on, we had a global economy that was becoming increasingly fragile. So 2008 was a lesson in facing the consequences, that's Capricorn, of excess, Jupiter. So that excessive expansion and risk-taking, the so-called too big to fail mentality and narrative, came crashing down unceremoniously, and Capricorn tightened the belt on that Jupiter. So the 2008 financial crisis was essentially caused by failures in financial regulation, too much Jupiter. The financial crisis was caused by too many financial firms acting recklessly, Jupiter. So the crisis was really caused by a mix of excessive borrowing and risk-taking by consumers and by Wall Street. So back then, we saw the dynamic between Jupiter in Sag and Jupiter in Capricorn. So people were buoyed up as per Sagittarius and Jupiter, unaware of the consequences of excessive risk and speculative capital, Jupiter speculation, this sort of casino-like global financial environment with financial instruments and derivatives that no one really understood. But then, as Jupiter entered Capricorn in 2008, it all came crashing down. So with Jupiter in Capricorn, we were all faced with a hard dose of Capricornian reality as the bubble burst. So as we sort of look back, a key lesson was about facing the consequences of excess. And we may very well find that this time around, we are confronted with similar lessons. So where does excess need to be reined in? And as we said, as we know, it's not just Jupiter in Capricorn, but we have to look at this in the context of Saturn and Pluto. So with Saturn and Pluto, we are already facing hard realities, confronting that Saturn, many things which we would rather not have to look at, Pluto. So the point is that Saturn and Pluto together, especially at the south node of the moon, this already lends itself to facing hard lessons, especially at the level of Capricorn institutions and governing structures, governments, banks, etc. So with Jupiter coming into this Saturn Capricorn mix, we can definitely see this heightened sense of learning lessons which have to do with facing the more unpleasant undersides of tendencies toward excess. Jupiter also very much has to do with learning and gathering of perspective. So Saturn and Pluto together in Capricorn speak to confronting lessons about the right use and correct application of power. So on a collective level, when Saturn and Pluto come together in Capricorn, we face some of the music in terms of corruption, greed. Saturn, Pluto in Capricorn initiates a cycle which demands the highest integrity of those who are in power and profound consequences for the misuse of power. As we've seen historically, the human consequences of misuse of power are grave. So with Jupiter in Capricorn, what comes to the foreground is we're going to be really looking at a lot of the ethical issues around our institutions. And as we know, astrological archetypal energies operate at many levels of consciousness simultaneously. So on the one hand, Jupiter in Capricorn, from a certain level of consciousness, will tend to stimulate this question of ethics and morality of institutions. People cropping up who demand higher, let's say more noble standards of integrity in terms of Capricorn institutions. But on the other hand, we know that Jupiter is a magnifying and amplifying influence. And as it dances with Saturn and Pluto, as it conjuncts the south node of the moon, we can also see within the collective a sort of amplifying of the old unconsciousness around how we have expressed Capricorn, Saturn, and Pluto. So Jupiter at the south node having to do with the past, what obtained in the past patterning. So on the one hand, with Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto dancing together, this can lend itself toward developing a deeper, more strengthened structure of moral consciousness throughout the collective, but it can also amplify the old unconsciousness surrounding power, greed, the shadow of institutions, the manner in which institutions and corporations have operated, big pharma, big media conglomerates, the food industry, now big tech, etc. And in regard to big tech, stay tuned for Pluto in Aquarius as we will see some of the darker elements of the tech industry come to the foreground in extremely heightened ways. So we have about 4 or 5 more years until Pluto enters Aquarius. So we look out for that. But in the meantime, perhaps it will do us well to remember that the body and the soul interfacing with the body is the ultimate technology. So we have at our disposal an intricate, rich biological computer in the form of the body, and we have so much to discover in terms of how the soul consciousness operates within the body and what the body is capable of when we learn to use our consciousness. But that's a bit of a tangent there. So historically, what we've witnessed in many respects is that these institutions and corporations have tended to create their wealth from a consciousness of disempowerment, which says that in order for me to be successful, I must operate by fooling people, I must manipulate them, hide things from them. Pluto in Capricorn, institutions, corporations, hiding things, the sort of murky undertones of corporations, Pluto in Capricorn. So I must disenfranchise people, get them addicted, manipulate their perceptions, tell them untruths and false claims. I must contaminate the environment with no respect for life in order to get what I want. So creating from this consciousness of disempowerment, I must control and shut down people's freedom to think by all sorts of nefarious and insidious psychological mechanisms and strategies. So Jupiter in Capricorn represents on one level this heightened moral consciousness around these issues, but also on different levels, seeing these very problems and issues magnified and amplified throughout the collective. So with Jupiter in Capricorn, as in the previous cycle, we can have a personal and a collective awareness of the dynamic between excess, material expansion, growth on one hand, and austerity and contraction. So excess, expansion, growth, again, Jupiter, and austerity, contraction, Capricorn, and Saturn, Pluto in Capricorn, especially there in terms of contraction. So the question is, what is the psychological orientation required to navigate this Jupiter in Capricorn transit? So with Jupiter in Capricorn, personal opportunities and growth tend to come along when we embrace the higher attributes of Capricorn, the idea of spiritual adulthood, which involves a consciousness of responsibility and integrity. That Capricorn word there, integrity. So opportunities come when you focus on what is real and tangible. Of course, this is all amplified, or let's say doubly emphasized, by Saturn's presence in Capricorn. Of course, Saturn disposits that Jupiter in Capricorn. Saturn governs any planet in Capricorn. So there's an extra emphasis on getting a lot of mileage from a pragmatic focus on what's real and what needs to be done. So a mature, grounded focus on what needs to be done, growth and opportunities come from having this sort of orientation and not being afraid to rise to the demands of that Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So Saturn-Pluto demands cultivating profound discipline and endurance, strength, fortitude, and tenacity. So with Saturn-Pluto, we also have the capacity to overcome the most demanding challenges and difficulties. So inner grit, resilience, and resourcefulness, a profound sense of responsibility, right use of power and integrity, like we've said, restructuring of our basic priorities. So Jupiter in Capricorn is also pointing to the rewards and expansion that come from a mature orientation. So the Saturn Capricorn matrix has to do with the things that we have to do that we may not always feel like doing, but we do them anyway because they're important and necessary. So we may not always feel like getting out of bed to take care of children, but we do it simply because we have a responsibility to do it. So we bring children into the world, and maturity and responsibility demand that we take care of them. So Jupiter in Capricorn speaks to the rewards that are gained when we rise to the occasion, when we rise to what is asked of us, when we meet the challenge. So with Capricorn, more than other signs, and especially with Saturn being in Capricorn, Jupiter here says you have to qualify for the rewards by demonstrating your ability to be impeccable with your maturity and your sense of responsibility. And as Jupiter goes into Capricorn, we see that it's now approaching the sextile with Neptune. So 60-degree angular relationship. So from February of 2020, Jupiter in Capricorn moves into the sextile with Neptune and dances in a sextile with Neptune throughout the rest of the year. So whereas the Jupiter in Sagittarius, Neptune in Pisces squares tended toward a sort of ballooning, that's Jupiter of unreality, Neptune, a sort of magnifying of fog in terms of perception and the inability to gain perspective, especially in a sea of all sorts of digitized pictures and data, a sea of all sorts of swirling opinions and speculations, fake this and fake that. Jupiter in Capricorn will lend itself toward more of a grounded, practical understanding and perception. Jupiter has to do with perception on one level, holistic perception, seeing the bigger picture. So Jupiter is important in terms of assessing our collective perceptual faculty. So Jupiter in Capricorn will find it a little easier to contend with Neptune in Pisces. So you've probably noticed that in 2019, in heightened ways, sorting through truth from reality and gaining meaningful perspective has been more of a challenge. Again, in this digitized sea of information, all sorts of claims and speculations being made, and you've probably realized it would be prudent for you to think a bit, scrutinize a bit before you accept data or information or someone's opinion. So Jupiter in Capricorn, from a perceptual perspective, can sort of stand its ground better in relation to the cognitive challenges and cognitive fog that's presented by Neptune in Pisces. So with the sextile, though, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So yes, Jupiter in Capricorn supports opportunities that come from a pragmatic, grounded disposition, but we still have access to or support from this sort of Neptunian imagination and vision. So opportunities come through Capricornian attributes of diligence and discipline, focus, practicality, having a plan that's grounded. But the sextile to Neptune in Pisces says, hey, faith and trust in a bigger scheme, faith and trust in an unseen reality of benevolence which supports you is also important. So spiritual trust and confidence, that's Jupiter, in the unseen realities, Neptune, that prop up and sustain your existence will support your practical efforts and will enable opportunities to come to you. So let's dig down a bit now. In terms of understanding this Jupiter in Capricorn transit, we can't understand this Jupiter in Capricorn transit without examining the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions. So Jupiter is within 2 degrees of Pluto from March to July 2020. So in terms of the dates, the first exact conjunction takes place during the beginning of April. There's another at the end of June 2020 and a third and final exact conjunction in November. So Jupiter conjunct Pluto, the power of truth. Jupiter, whenever it enters a sign, represents an invitation to understand more of the truth about the sign domain that it's in. So with Jupiter in Capricorn, we have an opportunity to see the truth and the bigger picture of Capricorn things. So on a global level, the structures of governance, and on a personal psychological level, the truth about your inner orientation to maturity and responsibility, your vocation, etc., work, etc. On a personal psychological level, we would look to the house of the chart that Jupiter in Capricorn is transiting for a more refined view of things, to see exactly where we have opportunities for expanded comprehension and understanding. Of course, we also want to understand the planets and the chart configurations that Jupiter in Capricorn is triggering for us personally. Jupiter in Capricorn highlights people with important placements in Capricorn and the rest of the cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra. And we also want to pay attention to the degree range of 27 Capricorn down to 17 Capricorn. So Jupiter stations retrograde in May 2020 and goes direct in September. So that's the important degree range to pay attention to. So Jupiter will be highlighting whatever you have going on in this degree range of Capricorn and of the cardinal sign. So 27 down onto 17. Now, with Jupiter going through a house, it tends to support us understanding this department of our lives and psyches better. It tends to support improving and expanding this department of life. It supports acting with more confidence and self-belief in that dimension of experience, throwing off self-imposed limitations and moving toward the future version of yourself that you sort of precognitively recognize. So in terms of assessing Jupiter's transit through a house, you want to bear these considerations in mind, and you want to also think about the psychological orientations that we just talked about in terms of how to approach these departments of your life. Opportunities coming through, an embrace of these sorts of Capricornian qualities and characteristics. Yes? So yes, Jupiter conjunct Pluto, the power of truth. So Jupiter joined up with Pluto promotes coming into a deep, holistic perspective, a deeper comprehension of things, an understanding of what's beneath the surface. So for those of you who are invested in figuring things out, especially on a sort of planetary level, for those of you who are invested in seeing the bigger picture, this can be a rewarding time in terms of helping to deepen your comprehension. But Jupiter to Pluto can also act to magnify things, to reveal the truth about things which were meant to be hidden. Pluto. So the other piece here to consider is that we could find that a lot of the dirty laundry of institutions becomes impossible to ignore. So the hidden, covert facets of institutional procedures and policies which perhaps the public isn't so aware of. So Jupiter conjunct Pluto in Capricorn supports this sort of revelation, of coming to light, the truth coming forward about what goes on behind the closed doors of institutions, the hidden dynamics that the public isn't aware of or which the public really doesn't want to acknowledge exists. That's the thing with Pluto in both the individual and collective psyches. It often represents a place we don't want to visit. We don't want to open that Pandora's box for fear of what we may find there. So Jupiter to Pluto, the power of truth, revelation of truth about things which we may have preferred to leave unacknowledged, especially as it relates to what actually goes on within the institutions that we look up to, that's Capricorn, and which we've been conditioned to believe have humanity's best interest at heart. So, with Pluto impacting that Jupiter, as a result of coming into truths about hidden dynamics, as a whole, we will find that Jupiter in Capricorn is a collective invitation into a more mature and adult, that's Capricorn perspective, Jupiter. A maturation of perspective that goes along with an overhaul and transformation, that's Pluto, of our beliefs, Jupiter, the beliefs that we've held. So our beliefs become overhauled and we have to invest in more mature perspectives and beliefs. The Saturn Capricorn matrix invites us to quote unquote put away childish things. So Jupiter in Capricorn invites a personal and collective maturing of perspective from naivety to a serious awareness of what's going on. So just as what we had to face in 2008, when we went from a total naivety about the consequences of debt and too much risk, to a serious awareness of what was actually happening in our global financial system. That moment representing a sobering of our perspective, Jupiter in Capricorn. And this sort of dovetails into the evolutionary imperatives of the whole Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto complex. So heavy or difficult experiences, Saturn, Pluto, with an ultimately positive benefit, Jupiter. And one of those benefits can just be expansion of your perspective. So Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, triple conjunction in Capricorn. Opportunities for personal empowerment, provided that you navigate challenging experiences with maturity and that you're willing to face the necessary lessons. So the growth promoting capacity and value of challenging, painful, or difficult experiences. So just like we did 12 years ago, another theme that we could be confronting is the shadow, Pluto, of excess, Jupiter. Now, with this Jupiter-Pluto dance, the other thing that we want to be mindful of is this business of extreme beliefs, fanaticism, but sort of more insidious than this is this business of theories, that's Jupiter, being marshaled to being marshaled as a control mechanism, or sort of being used to justify harmful acts, that's Pluto. So historically, we've seen how, for example, the theoretical framework of eugenics was used to justify harmful acts based on notions of racial superiority. So an example there of how theories and beliefs can be used to justify harmful actions. The theoretical framework of eugenics, the theory of eugenics, offered people in power a supposedly scientific notion to justify policies and laws that were detrimental to certain races of people. So certain beliefs and notions, that's Jupiter, being used to oppress, Saturn, Pluto. So we've said quite a bit here. We have to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. This honest sort of matter-of-fact look at things is also quite Saturnian as well. So we have to understand Jupiter in Cap in the context of Saturn and Pluto conjunct. So with Saturn and Pluto conjunct beginning a new synodic cycle, it's certainly a weighty moment, demanding so much from us collectively and personally. So we've been through many Saturn-Pluto interchanges in the past, with Saturn and Pluto conjunct in 1914. We had World War I when Saturn and Pluto opposed each other. 1930 thereabouts, we had the Great Depression When Saturn was square Pluto around 1939, we had the beginning of World War II. When Saturn joined up with Pluto in the early 80s, there was huge Cold War hostility, global nuclear arms race, and profoundly globally impactful and restructuring neoliberal policies of Reagan in America and, of course, Margaret Thatcher in England. So going back to your politics there, and that's what I did in school there, looking at global policy. All right, so of course, when Saturn opposed Pluto, we had September 11, an immense turning point on the globe, a sort of important timeline moment for humanity as well. So Saturn-Pluto interchanges represent profound turning points globally, and we have to have our wits about us. But throughout all of the challenges and the pivotal turning points next year, 2020, Jupiter still reminds us to have a good attitude. So Jupiter in Capricorn says, yes, things can be challenging, but I'm still holding out with a good attitude. And in the meantime, I'll do my best to be practical about keeping my affairs in order, solid financial management, cutting down on waste and overspending in my personal life. So Jupiter in Capricorn says, let's have a good attitude while we keep our nose to the grindstone. And with Jupiter in Capricorn, feelings of confidence and faith come from your ability to demonstrate to yourself your own impeccability in keeping your life organized, Capricorn, and attending to your affairs in a pragmatic way. So feelings of self-belief, that's Jupiter, come when you show yourself your own impeccable maturity, even if that maturity means, well, I have to give up some of my old, outmoded, naive ideas and overhaul some of my perspectives as per Jupiter-Pluto. All right, so as always, we will keep abreast of the astrology in our bi-monthly astrology of the month videos. We will no doubt be continuing the conversation and reminding you that, as usual, I'm available for private astrological counseling consultations, and links to that are in the description box below. I'll also be adding more downloadable store content, audio classes, etc., so you can keep an eye out for that. So wishing you all the very best and clarity of mind as we navigate these challenging but edifying moments together. So until next time, talk soon. Bye.